Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. My name is Suzanne Mose and I'm a curator here at the City of Niagara Falls Museums. Today we're going to take a tour through an exhibition that we launched back in 2016 in partnership with the Niagara Falls Art Gallery. It was called Faces, Portraits from Our City, and it was an opportunity for both of us to focus specifically on the portraits that we each have in our collections. For the museum, we have some really interesting civic style portraiture to share with you, while the art gallery has some really fabulous, much more contemporary works of art for you to see in this exhibition. Faces was a really fun show to put together. It gave us a great opportunity to talk not only about historic figures in our community, but also to touch a little bit on the history of portraiture and the theory of portraiture. And with everything that's going on in the world right now, we thought that resurrecting old exhibitions like this in a digital format would just be a really fun thing to do. It's just kind of a walk through the images that we actually hung in our temporary gallery in 2016. You will hear me talking throughout, explaining some of the thinking of how we curated the show, and like I said, a little bit of the history and the theory. Thanks again for joining us. I hope you enjoy looking at these beautiful images from the museum and the art gallery. Here we have the first pair of portraits that you would have seen in our gallery when the exhibition was hanging here in 2016. This is a really great example of something that might be referred to as a society portrait. The gentleman is Samuel Zimmerman, and that's his wife alongside him, Margaret Ann Zimmerman, formerly Margaret Ann Woodruff, both early and prominent Niagara families. These paintings would have been done around the mid-19th century, just as Canada was making its way to nationhood. It was that time of rapid growth and wealth and power in the country. There was definitely a burgeoning middle class, all very eager to collect and display symbols of their achievements, symbols of their wealth, and paintings like this were the perfect way to do that. This, as you can see, is a 3/4 length portrait. Something like this was always loved by both the artist and the sitter. There's a lot of canvas there to display exactly what the sitter would have been trying to depict. Behind Zimmerman, you can see a large stone column. You can see the velvet draperies and their fine clothes. They're very conservative clothes, but they're definitely fine clothes. And there are books on the table to indicate education. All of these things that would have shown their wealth and their station in society. All in all, just a really couple of lovely portraits that belong to the City of Niagara Falls Museum collection. Sadly, we don't know the artist. We know the medium is oil on canvas, very typical for that time. But like I said, unfortunately, we don't know the artist who painted them. So now I'm going to shift gears quite a bit, and I'm going to take you to a series of paintings that come from the Niagara Falls Art Gallery. The idea for the art gallery was conceived by Ola and Mykola Kolankiewski around 1970, and by the time we get to the mid to late 1970s, the gallery is in operation. And more than 40 years later, it's still here in the city and it's still serving the community. This next set of paintings begins in 1959 and it spans more than 2 decades. And what we know about the Kolankiewskis is that they would commission artists to do portraits of themselves. So this series is a really great example of a single subject portrayed in a variety of ways by a variety of artists. Ola and Mykola were not wealthy art patrons. They were an immigrant couple, and they truly believed that art was for everyone. And it was something that they certainly believed that the citizens of Niagara Falls and that their local community should have access to. One other thing that we know is that they entertained a lot of artists and residents over the years. So that would give them the ability to work with this variety of people as they traveled through Niagara Falls to create this magnificent collection of portraits of themselves. This next section of the exhibition we called Likeness, and we really wanted to remind the visitor that portraits need not always be a realistic depiction of an individual, that often an artist can take a moment like a portrait and make the character a little bit more elusive, create a much more stylized image that lacks some details. And these are a handful of really good examples from the Niagara Falls Art Gallery's collection that do a good job of showing us that. Similar to the last section called likeness, where we wanted to show examples of portraits that were not full of exacting detail and exacting brushstrokes, we also created this section, which we called media. And we took this as our opportunity to showcase a few images from the collection that reminded the visitor that the traditional media of oil on canvas or watercolor or charcoal on paper aren't always necessary to create a really interesting portrait. Probably my favorite example of this were these three stained glass portraits that belong to the Niagara Falls History Museum collection. These, when down in storage and hung up against a wall, didn't really look like much, but this was a great opportunity for us to get them up out of storage, and as soon as we put them in the light, you can see all of the detail and the care and the artistry in something as interesting as stained glass. At almost 60 centimeters in diameter, these pieces are quite large, quite substantial. Unfortunately, we don't know who the artist was, and we're not really sure who they're supposed to represent either. Sticking with the collection from the Niagara Falls History Museum for a few minutes, I'm going to next show you the section that we entitled Civic Portraits. Now, this is a really good example of the portraits that are intended to communicate something quite different than you might communicate if you were having a personal portrait done. But it's important to remember, just like a family or an individual who wants to convey a sense of who they are, so would somebody like a city official. And that's what we see in this little selection of civic portraiture. This is probably my favorite portrait in the collection at the museum. This is George Hannon. He was the first mayor of Niagara Falls. And this painting was done in 1954, and it was done by an artist named Anthony J. Sisti, or Tony Sisti. Somewhat local. We know he was born in New York, and we know he died in Buffalo. And a fairly well-known artist. He was trained in Florence, Italy. And when you look at the detail of this painting, you can see that he was a pretty talented guy. Overall, I'd say this is a very traditional civic portrait style. It's a great size. Proportions are excellent at 48 centimeters wide and 58 centimeters tall. Oil on canvas. So everything about it very traditional, very classic. The energy in these official portraits definitely depicts a sense of authority and of self-importance. There's a deliberate formality in these, that's there to convey a feeling of power that's intended, I think, to affirm the status of this individual. These would have been commissioned, and the sitter would have been very specific about what they wanted to depict and what they wanted the audience to see. A great example of that is if you look at this image of A. Monroe Greer, who was the vice president of the Canadian Niagara Power Company. So that backdrop was very specifically selected to show exactly what he wanted you, the viewer, to see. So the final section of our tour today was one that we named Paired Works. And it was for the simple reason that often instead of being painted together on one canvas, couples might ask for individual portraits to be done by the same artist. When this is done, you'll often see common or unifying factors in each of the paintings. Maybe the canvas size is the same or the color palette is the same, but it does give the artist the opportunity to paint two quite different people, quite different personalities when you choose this style of portraiture. Ola and Makola have left behind a beautiful legacy, not only in these magnificent paintings, but in the art gallery that, like I said earlier, has been serving the community for over 40 years now. And that's where we're going to leave our tour today. Thank you again for joining me. I hope you enjoyed looking at this exhibition in this digital form. It was a real pleasure to put this together, getting an opportunity to work with other collecting institutions in the city, getting an opportunity to get some of the objects up out of storage, the ones that I don't always have on display, is a real win for me at the City of Niagara Falls Museums. So thanks again for joining me, and I hope you'll tune in later for some more shows that we'll put on through Not at the Museum Thursday nights.